It'll be a few minutes before we start, so I'll let you know when we're ready. Good evening, everyone. For those of you who are with us and for those of you who are on Zoom, and welcome to those of you in the room for our first in-person meeting since COVID began. So it's great to be back. Yes. And we are so happy to be here at the Reuters Center, where we can have the opportunity to be on Zoom as well. So thank you for your participation. And if you are on Zoom, please note that you are muted. And if you need to ask a question, please put that in the chat box and we will get to it. So thank you. Let me change the screen. And we're all new at what we're doing, so please hang with us as we figure it all out. And I'm Nancy Waldrop, Vice Chair of the Western North Carolina Sierra Club. I'm standing in for Judy this evening, so I'm not as good as Judy is at doing this, so please bear with me as well. Explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. That is the Sierra Club motto. And we hope you take that as your motto as well. And we would like to take a moment of our meeting time this evening to acknowledge that with respect, the land that we are on today is the ancestral land of the Cherokee, and we thank them for protecting our forest and our environment for so many generations. And we have some upcoming hikes that you might want to participate in. The first one on May the 13th, you can hike to Moore's Cave waterfall in the Pisgah National Forest, and that is with Ed Maggart, who I think is with us this evening. Ed, if you're here, then you've probably already met him, and he will be your hike leader if you want to go on that hike. And also on May 20th, you have the opportunity to go to Graybeard Falls in Montreat. And Bill Snow is leading that hike, and I'm not sure he's with us this evening. He is on Zoom. You might see him there. And if you need more information or want to sign up for one of these hikes, please go to our website, wncSierraclub.org, for information and how to sign up. And we need a meetup person to do our meetup announcements about our hikes and other things that we have. So if you are interested in being a volunteer to do that, please let me know at the end of the meeting or anytime, and we will make sure that you get the information on how to do that as well. And Asheville City Council is considering a local ordinance to prohibit single-use plastic bags and styrofoam takeout containers. While the survey period for this ordinance has ended, for this potential ordinance, please keep your support of this effort going. And in the meantime, there are other local recycling opportunities that you can have. And the first one is to get rid of plastic bags, film, and wraps. The UNCA Sustainability Office has a collection bin at the Reuters Center at Ollie near room 230. Bring most clean and dry polyethylene labeled as number 2 or number 4, and bubble wrap, Ziploc bags, plastic wrap, or packaging films. That's all being accepted. And if you have questions about any of this, if you live in the city of Asheville, please contact Waste Wizard. And if you live in Buncombe County, you can contact Curbside Management, which is at www.kirby.com/residential.html. And our next Western North Carolina Sierra Club program will be on the first Wednesday of June, June the 7th at 7 p.m. And we will be in person here, just like tonight, at the Reuters Center in room 102. Our program, presented by RiverLink, will be the past, the present, and the future of the French Broad River. If you need to Zoom the meeting online, please register at our website, wncSierraclub.org. As you have undoubtedly noticed, beginning this month, we are not only back in person, but our meeting time and our meeting place have changed as well. We will, going forward, be meeting on the first Wednesday of each month here at the Reuters Center in room 102. This will be our new schedule, except in months like July, when we will have a picnic or other special occasions warrant a different venue. For tonight's program, which is the Nantahala Pisgah National Forest Plan, which we have literally waited years to hear about. Our usual Q&A will be after the speakers are finished. And if you are on Zoom, you may continue to put your questions in the chat box. For those of you here, we will be coming around with a microphone and we'll take your questions one at a time. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have 3 experts on the forest plan with us. Sam Evans from the Southern Environmental Law Center, Josh Kelly from Mountain True, and our own David Reed. These guys really need no introduction, and those familiar with environmental causes. However, David will introduce Sam and Josh when he speaks, and it is my pleasure to introduce David to you. What you probably already know about David Reed is that he has a great passion for the forest and the environment, and has been an invaluable service and involvement to the Sierra Club. What you may need to know about David is he has been involved in the national forest issues as a volunteer with the North Carolina chapter of Sierra Club, harking back to the mid-1980s. Most recently, he has represented the club in the plan revision process. As a paid career, he is retired from MAHEC, where he was Director of Information Technology. He enjoys hiking, kayaking, and traveling in addition to environmental causes. So without further delay, David, I'll turn the program over to you. Out of your way.
Thanks, Nancy. So one thing that she didn't mention, of course, is as of last year, I'm a new grandfather, so I just gladly add that to my role. But more important to protect the environment and the resources that we have for future generations. I only an expert in the sense of a volunteer and a layperson. We really have two real experts in the room tonight to help me present information about the forest plan. So anyway, I'm going first. And I wanted to start out, I'm going to move pretty quickly through some slides to just kind of ground you in some basics. What is the Forest Service? And that's pretty basic. It's an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Pre-1905, we had some agency to try to manage forests, but in 1905, it really became the Forest Service with a gentleman known as Gifford Pinchot as the first director of the Forest Service. They manage 154 national forest units across the country, which amounts to around 193 million acres of land, of which we have 1.1 million of those acres in Western North Carolina. So there's a difference I frequently get some questions or confusions about national parks versus national forest. So they largely breaks down between a different vision about what public lands are about. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is where the Forest Service is versus the Department of Interior where the Park Service is, and represents different visions from Gifford Pinchot and of course our own Sierra Club founder, John Muir. Here's some quotes for both of them. John Muir, everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in where nature may heal. It gives strength to body and soul alike. A quote from Gifford Pinchot, conservation means the wise use, and that's my underline, of the earth and its resources for the lasting good of men. So you can see a little different vision there. The National Park Service is really, in addition to other legacy, but John Muir was certainly involved in the beginning. And their mission is to preserve unimpaired natural and cultural resources and the values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of the future. The Forest Service mission statement contains this. As set forth in law, the mission is to achieve quality land management under the sustainable multiple use management concept to meet diverse needs of the people. So again, if you had to characterize that, more of a preservation versus this land can be preserved, but it can also be used for things. So forestry in Western North Carolina, there was a period of time where all of our lands were basically denuded and cut over by abusive logging practices around the turn of the 20th century. So there was an effort to acquire these lands. They were known as the lands nobody wanted because they were so abused. Western forests were already in public ownership, so we had to create legislation to authorize the purchase of forest lands in the eastern United States known as the Weeks Act. And the first tract that was purchased under the Weeks Act is near Curtis Creek on the Pisgah National Forest. So like I said, the total national forest in North Carolina is 1.2 million acres. That includes the Uwharrie and the Piedmont and the Croatan on the coast. But the Pisgah Nantahala is by far the largest national forest, two national forests in North Carolina. The last forest plan was published way back in 1987, I believe, and last major amendment was in 1994. And my slides are bleeding off the screen, but the revision process started somewhere back in 2012, 2013. Sam, correct me if I'm wrong about that. Is that close? Yeah. They publish a notification that they're going to start revising the plan, and that's what triggered this long process of plan revision. So there's some main laws and regulations that govern forest planning. The national forests are governed under what's known as the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, which comes from 1960. The National Environmental Policy Act passed in 1969, and the National Forest Management Act in 1976. Other guiding pieces of legislation that have to be incorporated when the planning for the forest are Endangered Species Act, 73, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. So all these get involved somehow to a more or lesser degree in planning. But a lot of these occurred, these landmark pieces of legislation, of course, occurred back in the 70s and 60s. So it's time for a pretty picture, basically. That was a lot of stuff to throw at you. This is an interesting tree in near Craggy Mountain. So what does a forest plan do? It's a lot like a zoning plan. There are defined management areas within which may be applied a common management approach to meet goals and objectives. And goals and objectives are set forth in the plan, as well as forest-wide standards and guidance. And each management area has a management emphasis. So there are many competing, when you remember the quote from Pinchot in the mission statement of the Forest Service is about multiple use. And this sets up a tension within the Forest Service that probably doesn't exist to a great extent within the national parks. But competing interests and stakeholders and political influence all play a role in making the process very complex and very hard to resolve as far as public policy. So these are just some of the little items that the forest plan tries to balance. So we came up recently with the forest plan being released after all those years of draft and public comment and objection, and their preferred alternative in the final plan was alternative E. But basically, I just wanted to show you these different ways that the management areas are depicted in the forest plan map as different colors, including some terms. I blew up a little section here so you could see that we have a management area called matrix, a management area called interface, a management area called backcountry, as well as some special designations. And all these are color coded. This happens to be the Craggies and the Mount Mitchell and the Blacks and the area east of Old Fort depicted here. So I picked one that was fairly close to us, but you can see each color coding represents a different management area that has been finalized in the plan. Just a quick run through of some of the major ones. Matrix management areas, that's the most open to active management, including timber production and timber harvesting, road building. Interface is where the Forest Service says the most human activity occurs, including recreation, whether it be along trails or scenic byways or roads. Backcountry, where remote and non-motorized dispersed recreation use is emphasized. Recommended wilderness and wilderness study areas, and those are areas to be managed to preserve their wilderness characteristics as defined by the Wilderness Act until Congress makes a decision on their ultimate status. So there are special designations, like I said. Some of these are listed here that you can read. I won't go through them. But these are all, the ones on the left are all Forest Service agency designations, which are designated in the plan. The ones on the right are designations that are made by Congress. So when Congress makes these designations, it basically, in perpetuity for all subsequent forest plans, the forest plan can't change that designation because that's a congressional designation. The Wilderness Act of 1964 set forth the idea of a national wilderness preservation system in which, and it was defined as in contrast with areas where man and his developments and works, especially in the eastern United States, dominates, is recognized in an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man and where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. So this is it's a hard concept for a lot of people to get through and think about, because what it means is that we have to be humble enough that maybe we don't need to be actively managing every square mile of the Earth's surface. So as part of the planning process, as required by law, they had to do a wilderness inventory and evaluation and invite the public to provide input, and where our three organizations really got involved. And that began, I think, around 2014 or 2015 with a wilderness inventory that equaled around 364,920 acres. As conservation groups, we came together, and I think I'm basically right on this acreage, around 108,000 acres that we thought from those areas were deserving of wilderness designation or recommendation because of their characteristics. So we thought that what is known as wilderness study areas were created by the North Carolina Wilderness Bill of 1984, which created some new wilderness, but also designated by Congress some wilderness study areas. So those have had to been managed until Congress acts again as for their wilderness characteristics. So we recommended all of 5 of those areas, which you can read here. And there was some extensions to existing wilderness, which we thought were deserving to be added to existing wilderness, including Joyce Kilmer, Southern Nantahala, Ellicott Rock, Middle Prong, Shining Rock, and Linville Gorge, which are most of our existing wilderness on the forest. And then some new wilderness areas, which we thought were deserving. The Black Mountains, which are by and large, they're the eastern and northern flank of the Blacks, which include Mount Mitchell. Mount Mitchell is within a state park, but these are the national forest lands. Mackey Mountain, which is east of Old Fort, little northeast. Tusquetty-Vald, way out in the western part of the state near Andrews. And the Unicoi Mountains and the Upper Bald River, which is way out in Cherokee County, about as far as you can go in North Carolina. So I'm not sure what happened to this slide in the process, but let me see if I can get through it. The wilderness recommendations in the final plan, of course, were a bit disappointing to us. The good news is that they did recommend some wilderness areas. They recommended most of the wilderness study areas. And so we do have some wilderness recommendations in the plan that we can eventually get behind. But out of all the alternatives, they recommended the least acreage that they could have recommended based on their analysis in the other alternatives in the plan. So in other words, they recommended more areas in some of the alternatives, which they had to feel that were qualified for recommendation, but that didn't end up in the final plan for some reason. So these are the notable omissions in my humble opinion that they didn't recommend: the Black Mountains, the Tusquetty Mountains, the Overflow Wilderness Study Area, which would still retain congressional protection as a study area, the extensions around Linville Gorge, and the Ellicott Rock extensions. So for areas that we're concerned about, either as a part of that initial large wilderness inventory or as some of the areas that they didn't recommend, we'll have to keep an eye on those, because some of those areas got placed in those management areas, as you recall, where they can propose logging or active management. So that'll be a task for the future. So what's next? The most promising thing is that there is wide support, unanimous support in Buncombe County, large number of people that support the creation of a national scenic area that would encompass the Craggy Mountains and the area known as Big Ivy north of Asheville. So we might see possible congressional action on that. Our new freshman congressman may be interested in moving that forward. We don't know for sure yet, but there are conversations. This would be a national scenic area with an embedded wilderness. There is a wilderness study area and a recommended wilderness within the Craggy Big Ivy area. So you'd have 2 different designations, but Congress has to pass that law to make that designation. So my encouragement to everyone here and on Zoom is be an advocate for wilderness that needs you. The voices that kind of would want more of the forest open to that active management right now seem to politically outweigh the voices that would advocate for wilderness. So we need all the advocates we can get for wilderness. So congressional action will depend ultimately on political and public support, especially in the far western part of the state. So wilderness needs you. And with that, I'm going to conclude my part. I think that was my last slide, one more pretty picture. But I will now want to introduce Sam Evans. I get my cheat sheet here, but I pretty much know Sam. Sam is a senior attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. We were lucky to have, first of all, an Asheville office of the Southern Environmental Law Center, but Sam heads up the National Forest and Parks Program and for the Southern Environmental Law Center. And as long as I've known Sam and started after my retirement, really working on forest issues again, I have been really impressed by his tact and his diplomacy, his gentlemanness in getting across his point, but his insistence and working with a variety of points of view. I think we can have no more effective legal assistance and legal support than Sam Evans from the Southern Environmental Law Center. We have to figure out how to change the slide program here.
Just stop share.
Okay. Okay. Ready?
Well, David, thanks. And thanks for laying the foundation there. That was a really good primer on sort of why we do planning, what planning looks like, and some of the laws and the rationales for those laws that all this is based on. I'm going to get right into the new plan and what it does and doesn't do. I got my law license in 2009, so I've been working on the Nantahala Pisgah plan for most of my career, since it started, since the very first collaborative meeting, which I think was back in 2013, may even have been at the end of 2012. I have sort of become a bitter cynic, where I started as a naive optimist. There was a lot of reason to be optimistic at the beginning of this process. David mentioned Gifford Pinchot as sort of the spiritual head of the Forest Service, and still is, I think, in many people's eyes. One of his famous quotes is that this was a direction to the Forest Service to find out in advance what the public will stand for. And that's what you do. And so even Pinchot, who advocated for the wise use of public lands, recognized that use had to be bounded by the public's consent. And of course, there are a lot of publics. There are a lot of different voices coming from the public. And in order to get a clear sense of what the social license is, what the public will stand for, it requires a collaborative process. And we had that in this process. We had folks got together from the environmental community, from the timber industry, from game wildlife groups and recreational groups, and put together a really clear picture for the Forest Service of what we call them the zones of agreement, but really just what the public would stand for. Gave the Forest Service a clear roadmap there. Another reason we were optimistic was because of the new planning rule. We'll talk a little bit more about that probably during this tonight, but the new planning rule was enacted right at the beginning of this planning process in 2012. Ours was an early adopter for us, sort of a test case for how that planning rule would work. In the past, under the National Forest Management Act, national forests were managed for economic efficiency. Finding out where you could run a timber sale program in an economically efficient way. That's how you figured out which management areas, which acres went into which zones, which acres went into which management areas. Under the 2012 rule, that paradigm shifted pretty dramatically to ecological integrity. So job number one for the Forest Service these days is supposed to be to restore ecological integrity. And we'll get into how that's going. I'd right that this is mostly lowlights. I think that is really the upshot of my presentation, is that we're not real pleased with how the plan turned out. Given all those reasons to be optimistic, the plan is basically a disappointment. But you wouldn't know that to go to the Forest Service's website. So if you go to the website to look and see what they say about the plan, this is what you'll see. So you see a splashy image of the wilderness that they're going to protect, this idea of an old growth network that's bigger than it has been in the past, all the species that they're going to protect, and wild and scenic rivers. And I think we have to dig a little bit under the surface to see why that's not a complete accurate picture. Is that? Thanks. Thank you. So this is a quote from the website. The planning team developed a balanced plan that supports the multiple uses and benefits of national forests, including recreation, water, wilderness, and wildlife habitat, healthy and resilient forests, and sustainable management. The new plan specifically emphasizes the ways people use the forest and the places that are important to them. What you don't see in that quote is the words timber production, but timber production is a big part of this plan. So what is timber production? I'll do the boring thing real quick here. Timber production is crop style tree farming. Timber production is defined by regulation as growing regulated crops of trees. And really the difference between timber production and timber harvest, which we do need to keep really separate, is that for timber production, the Forest Service has made a decision in advance at the planning level that it's going to go cut trees in these areas. So if an area is open to timber production, it's already made that decision. It's going to go cut trees there. It might decide in a specific location not to cut trees because there's a rare species or there's an archaeological find or a recreational resource that people really care about. So it can always not do that down the road, but it makes that decision up front. Timber harvest, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. So the Forest Service has not made a decision in advance what it's going to do. It's going to go look and see what needs to be done. And if that's timber harvest, well, that's on the table. This is a little bit more detail about the same thing. So acres considered suitable for timber production are places where repeat scheduled entry is planned. So it's a rotational style of logging. They're not places where ecological restoration is intended. So you can imagine that our degraded forests, like white pine plantations, might need timber harvest to bring them back to a more healthy, native, diverse condition. That's not timber production. So timber production is rotational timber harvest that's going to continue indefinitely. Ecological restoration, on the other hand, is going to see what needs to be done, doing it, and when you get it into a better condition, then you stop. You don't have to do it anymore. So if an area, if you're going to try to get areas back to their desired condition, and then you don't need timber harvest for maintenance, then there's no reason to continue doing it. And that's timber harvest as opposed to timber production. This is a busy slide, and I would invite you to focus mainly on the top right corner on the inset graph. So historically, under the current plan, that green line represents how much volume has come off the forest. So the Forest Service thinks about how many trees it cuts in terms of their volume. So 18,700 CCF per year has been our actual rate of timber production under the old plan. Under the new plan, the Forest Service expects to get up to as much as 110,000 CCF. And you can compare those to historical figures. That's what I've tried to do here on this graph. You can see back in the 80s, we had a big spike, sort of a peak in timber production, and the Forest Service's new plan aims for those same levels. And those were widely seen as unsustainable. Even really big logging proponents like the Wildlife Resources Commission of the state of North Carolina and really conservative rural counties believed that that level of timber production in the 80s was unsustainable. So what resulted in the 1994 plan amendment, which came pretty quick after the new or the 87 plan was adopted. Here's another barometer for how the new plan does. So these are their projections of what species they'll be cutting, and focus mainly on the oak and white pine categories. The other categories stay mainly the same, but the Forest Service expects to cut a lot less white pine and a lot more oaks under the new plan. And that's just an indicator that the type of silviculture that they intend to do, or that they say that they're going to do in their environmental impact statement, is less focused on ecological restoration and more focused on just basic timber production, saw timber. Here's the footprint. So the geographical footprint of timber production under the new plan. So the old plan, the orange slice there is lands considered suitable for timber production. These are the places where the Forest Service has made that decision in advance that it's going to go in there and do rotational logging. It covered a smaller part of the forest. Under the new plan, that orange slice grows considerably. And this, the colors are the same, but the topic is different. So this covers only the acres that the Forest Service could have gone either way with. There are some acres out there on the forest where the Forest Service doesn't really have any choice. And David mentioned one of those is wilderness. Inventoried roadless areas is another. Those are places where the Forest Service doesn't have any discretion under the forest plan. Well, this slide shows all the acres where they did have discretion. So to the extent that they could have gone one way or the other, they, by and large, dumped those acres into the suitable base. So what happens in the suitable base? Well, the timber production happens, rotational harvest, but historically, we get harvest of existing old growth forests, harvest in state designated rare habitats, harvest and road building in unroaded areas that have actually been inventoried as eligible for future wilderness designation. So the Forest Service is actively degrading these areas' character and and removing their eligibility for future wilderness designation by going in there and cutting and building roads. So we're going to zoom in for a second and see what this looks like. So 610 roughly 1,000 acres of the forest are in suitable management areas. Not all of those acres are considered suitable. So you'll see different numbers on this. The Forest Service says about 460,000 acres are considered suitable, so are scheduled for harvest. But here's what that looks like if you zoom into a specific area. So this is a portion of Big Ivy, the Coxcomb Mountain Ivy Knob section. And some of you have probably hiked in there. So these show the management areas. That light green color is matrix. The light yellow color is interface. Both of those are suitable for timber production. But if you look at just the suitable lands, you see these areas are cut out. So when you cut out the riparian zones and the very, very steep slopes out of these areas, you lose some of those acres. And that's why you'll see different numbers. But the footprint, as I said, of logging across the forest is 610,000 acres. And that entire area is going to be impacted by the use. So that's where the road construction will happen. That's where logging will be most visible. So that's what the plan says it wants to do. There were most of the folks who participated in the planning process were not necessarily opposed to timber harvest. They weren't even opposed to timber production categorically, and that includes myself. What we were really opposed to was doing those things in the wrong places without good protective sideboards. So we'll run through those real quickly. For soil and water, again, the Forest Service says, hey, everything is going to be fine. Let's see. activities, the logging and road building would not adversely affect water, would not adversely impact water quality. And in fact, would result in overall beneficial impacts to water quality by reducing erosion and sedimentation. And similarly, talking about road construction, the Forest Service says we won't have any gain in overall road miles, notwithstanding the fact that we're going to be increasing our harvest levels and spreading timber harvest into places that don't have roads. We're not going to wind up with any new roads because of that. This is BS. The current logging is already causing harm. Even at current levels, they are documenting in their own monitoring reports that they are harming waters every year in their projects. And we're talking about a nearly 6-fold increase in logging activities. So to say that you're going to multiply the harm that's happening now by 6, but that's going to equal 0 is bad math. And there's some other figures there we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on. But the road building one is important. The Forest Service admits that about 250,000 acres that it wants to do timber production in don't have good road access now. About 100,000 of those are in those eligible wilderness inventory areas and have few, if any, roads. So going into those places will absolutely require the development of new roads. Steep slopes is another area where we're pretty disappointed. The old plan had a default protective standard that prevented ground disturbing timber harvest on steep slopes. The new plan gives the local official carte blanche to decide what kind of timber harvest to use, including ground disturbing harvest. There's no real standard there anymore to prevent them from doing something harmful. Of course, you know, they have told us that they don't see a difference between those two standards, that there's always some discretion at the project level. But as a practical matter, this is a real big difference. Another way that we thought we might be able to get a handle on preventing the worst impacts of the plan was a focus on ecological restoration. And as I said, the new planning rule requires that. It requires a focus on ecological integrity. And that should shift the kind of work that the Forest Service is going to do. So instead of just going out and doing, you know, old school forestry, they ought to be going and looking for places where they can make the forest healthier, make it better with their logging projects. And that's what they say. They say that this is all about, the new plan is all about increasing the pace and scale of ecological restoration. And they're not going to do timber harvest for the primary purpose of timber production anymore. But I want to dig underneath this, and I hope you'll bear with me for a second. Restoration is notoriously hard to define, but the Forest Service's scientists did a pretty good job of defining what it means. It means, and in this plan, the definition is restoring the amounts and patch sizes of young forest that ought to be created by natural disturbance. So making the forest look structurally like they ought to look if we had a natural disturbance regime. So, you know, setting aside the history of human logging disturbance and land use, but like, what should the forest look like? How many patches of young forest should you have growing up? How many old forests should you have? How many acres of old forest should you have? And then restoring species composition. Those are the two big elements of what ecological restoration is. And the Forest Service is telling us in this plan that it's not going to do those things. They are only going to commit to restoring species composition in a really small fraction of the forest known as the ecological interest area. This is something that's sort of in between matrix and backcountry. It's an area that is that we advocated for because we thought it brought the potential for compromise. It was a place where timber harvest would be allowed, but only for specific good reasons. The Forest Service would not hold itself to that standard and limited that to a real small fraction of the total acreage of the forest. So according to the EIS, the Forest Service said that if they were to do that, if they were to focus on species composition and, you know, sort of trying to make the forest healthier at all these different scales at the same time, it would be fiscally infeasible. They say they need rotational timber harvest in order to package successful timber sales. So it's still a commercial efficiency driving the forest plan. They also say that they're not going to restore structure. So they say that their rotational harvest methods are going to create patches, large patches of young forest, large patches of recently logged areas that are way out of scale for what the forest ought to look like. They're going to do that because of, again, operations and financial considerations. So the thing that the Forest Service will commit to restore is young forest and open forest conditions. And as used in this plan, those are basically just euphemisms for clear cutting and thinning. And as I say here, the timber production, they say, is compatible with the plan because they do intend to rotationally log those timber suitable areas indefinitely. What does that mean for us in the next 20 years while we're living under this plan? Well, we're going to continue to fight over the things that we've been fighting over for the last 20 years. And the 1994 plan was a really good plan under the 1982 planning rule. The 2012 our new plan is a really bad plan under the 2012 planning rule. The 2012 planning rule is supposed to take plans into the future, and we're still stuck in the past. So we expect to fight over those same issues again and again, those old growth, natural heritage areas, and rare species habitats. I'll let Josh talk more about old growth, but I'll run through and just say what natural heritage areas are real quick. These are areas that the state of North Carolina has identified as being really important to rare species and habitats. They're rare and exemplary habitats. That's an area of the Nantahala National Forest. We've got 7,580 acres of the very, very highest, most important habitats as designated by the state, open to timber production in the plan. And you see these figures for those other tiers. Here's what that looks like on the ground. So this is another map where the colors are the same. The brown stuff is the suitable for timber production. These are the rotational logging areas. And here are the natural heritage natural areas that are in those suitable areas. So if you've ever hiked Wesser, Bald, or Wyabald, that's the area that we're showing here. And a lot of the view shed from the Appalachian Trail through this area, you're looking down on these areas. And then rare species, I'll show like a quick toggle of a slide. So keep your eyes peeled. I'll tell you when I'm gonna change it. But these are the really important areas for rare salamanders that have been modeled by the best experts in our region. And when I click the slide, you'll see how much of them are allocated to rotational timber harvest, which is really bad for salamanders. That's the difference there. So, and it's not just salamanders, that's the slide that I had a good map for, but we're talking about all the rare species that live on our forest that are sensitive to disturbance. So here we go, friction for the next 20 years, fragmentation of habitats, and an erosion of public trust through successive conflicts and bad projects. And the only way out of that is going to be some other path. The Forest Service could on its own decide to amend the plan. That is what happened on the last go around. We had the political will to amend the plan in a significant way. If folks keep advocating for that, it's a possibility that we could get it again this time. And so as this new plan goes into effect, if people are unsatisfied, we need to speak up. And the other alternatives that I mentioned here are the potential for litigation and new federal policies. I'll spend more time on the second one there. The Biden administration has said that conserving mature and old growth forests and storing carbon on federal public lands is a big priority. And so there's a policy process started in place right now that may culminate in a new protective policy that could add protections that the Nantahala Pisgah, the local folks, were not willing to accept on their own. So with that, I will pass it to Josh, or actually I'll pass it back to David. So.
Thank you, Sam. I want to do a brief introduction for Josh. Josh Kelly is public lands field biologist with Mountain True. That's off the website, so I assume that's the official title. And at Mountain True, Josh monitors logging and development issues on public lands and provides scientific information to promote the ecological restoration and oppose ecologically damaging management. And as I've known Josh in this revision process, I can be thankful that first of all, that we have Mountain True, who essentially functions as our forest watch group across the Pisgah and Nantahala, with their expertise led by Josh, is the first line of defense in the trenches in what Sam has said we've got to keep an eye on in the future. So, and Josh, I think area tonight is old growth, which you've heard about. So without further ado, we're going to figure out how to change slides and get Josh's presentation up.
Yeah, thanks, David. And it's good to be here. I just do want to take a minute to celebrate being here with Sierra Club and SCLC and all the victories that we have won together over the past number of years. So Sam talked about the 94 Amendment. That was an effort by the predecessors of Mountain True, the Western North Carolina Alliance, and largely the Sierra Club and SCLC to have the Forest Service remand the 1987 plan that called for essentially 500,000 acres of clear cutting over a century on our forest, and to come up with the 94 plan, which was super sustainable. And most recently, huge victory closing the Asheville coal-fired power plant and cleaning up coal ash ponds all over the state. So we've won some really big victories together, and I think we're going to continue to win some in the future. Yeah, I'm here to talk to you about a subject that I love. I love talking about these old growth forests. And for me, old growth, when I talk about old growth forest, I'm talking about the forests that have been changed the least by human activities in our region. And we're lucky to live in a region that still has some. There are huge areas of North America that have no old growth. We live in one of the last little strongholds of old growth in the eastern US. Let's see, please slide come up. This is really slow. Oh, there we go. Good. I do want to tell you a little bit about Mountain True, though. We do have a clean water program. We have 4 river keepers that track down pollution on the French Broad River, the Watauga River, the Broad River, and the Green River. We have a land use planning program called Healthy Communities Program. We also house under our umbrella the Creation Care Alliance, which brings people of faith together to protect the environment. And we have a public lands program that I work in. And David told you about a lot of what I do. But in addition to Nantahala and Pisgah National Forest, there are 1.7 million acres of federal public land in Western North Carolina. That includes Smoky Mountains National Park, Blue Ridge Parkway, called Sandberg home, 3.3 million acres across the Southern Blue Ridge, the eco region where we live. And there's about 1.8 million public acres total in Western North Carolina, including state and locally owned lands. So what Mountain True tries to do is really engage the public in public land management, because we believe that actually the public cares a lot about the condition of these lands, and when their voice is heard, things turn out better. We do provide site-specific scientific rationale for ecological management, and we work to accomplish ecological restoration and support community land protection efforts. Historically, we have helped raise money for the Needmore Tract, for DuPont State Forest, for Jocassee Gorges State Park, things like that. That Sierra Club has also been very active in, particularly Bill Thomas. One of our most successful campaigns was the Cut the Clear Cutting campaign that spanned the 1980s into the 1990s and resulted in the huge reduction of clear cutting across Western North Carolina. At the peak, 7,000 acres were cut in 1987, clear cut in Western North Carolina on Nantahala and Pisgah National Forest. And as Sam said, more recently, the average has been about 800 acres a year, which is quite sustainable in comparison. And here's a graph of what that arc of timber harvest looks like. So in the 70s, things were kind of chugging along at 2,000 to 3,000 acres. In the 80s, things exploded to the point where it became socially untenable. The Forest Service far exceeded their social contract, far exceeded the ecological limits they're working with. And the result has been this reduction we've seen for the past 20 years. And I believe that the Forest Service could probably log more, but they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to have a social license if they target old growth forests, state natural heritage areas, large unroaded areas. But But I do want to focus on old growth forest because this is one of the areas that I am probably the area I'm most disappointed in the forest plan. Old growth forest is a stage of forest development. Not necessarily a climax. Not all forests have some endpoint they reach and stay at. Forests are dynamic, they're changing. So forests can be old growth, but not necessarily climax. Do you want to draw a distinction between the concept of primary forests? Primary forests are the places that have never ever been logged or cleared by people for agriculture or timber or any other purpose. Now, just to tell you about that, primary forest though can be quite young. You can have a tornado or a hurricane or a wildfire, wipe out a primary forest, take it back to age 0. That is not an old growth forest, but it is primary. On the other hand, you can have areas that have been impacted by humans, and after a century or two, they can regain old growth condition. And the Forest Service has definitions that they use regionally to define old growth forest, which is a handy tool to have. I'm not going to get into those specifics here, but just know that the Forest Service does have definitions, which I think are actually fairly inclusive for old growth in the region. In the forestry world, this is how foresters conceive of old growth. This is the most accepted version, and this does kind of have sort of old growth as an endpoint rather than as a dynamic state. But essentially, in this model, all forests at some point are wiped out by a big disturbance, whether it's logging or a hurricane or whatever. You have that stand initiation phase, followed by a stem exclusion phase where the forest gets so shady that some of the shaded out trees fall over. And then you get an understory reinitiation phase where you have a new cohort of young trees springing up in the gaps created by those trees that were shaded out. And then finally, in the old growth phase, you have some of those trees in the reinitiation phase reaching the canopy. So you have more than one age class in the canopy. And you have this broken structure, big trees, old trees, etc. Now, old growth forests are important for just a myriad of reasons. They have really unique genetics. These are places where humans have not selectively removed the biggest, straightest trees, for example. They're habitat for specialized rare plants and animals that often cannot sustain the kind of disturbances that people bring when they bring in a bulldozer. They're really great for watershed protection. And oftentimes the remnants that we have are in the very steepest places that would be the most disastrous for watershed health to cut. Their living connection to a distant past, and both an evolutionary ecological past and a historical past. There's information for us to glean in both of those dimensions from these forests. And because they are so pristine, you might say, or so unaltered, they're typically very resistant to non-native invasive species. They tend to be in matrices of forests that are pretty big and be in the best condition. And they're models for understanding how forests work in the absence of human manipulation, how forests have worked for millions of years prior to the dominance of humans on this planet. And finally, they are places for recreation and connection to the natural world. A lot of people find the greatest spiritual connection they're going to find in the woods in these older forests. And they're just amazing places to visit. They produce a sense of awe and wonder that I think many of us can connect to. As a kind of a newer value, there are acknowledged as huge carbon sinks. These are places that really optimize carbon sequestration. They can have both a very high rate of carbon sequestration. These big old trees can actually pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere pretty quickly. And they have the highest possible capacity for carbon in both the soil and the living trees in the forest, compared to, say, more heavily human-influenced forests. And, people think about old growth, they think about big trees like this one. But old growth is not just big trees. So I want to help you all recognize old growth forest if you happen to be out in the woods hiking around. And so the things that I look for when I'm wondering, this is a pretty nice forest. Is this old growth? Number one, I'm going to look for any signs of historical human disturbance. If people had been in there logging, you're generally going to see some sort of logging trails or roads, cut stumps. Sometimes you'll even find steel cables, old logging paraphernalia. If you're lacking that, then that's a good sign. Maybe this is a patch of old growth. You're going to have a mixed age canopy structure. So you're going to see multiple age classes in the canopy. You have multiple canopy layers. So you're going to have short, medium, and tall trees and a kind of a broken up canopy. You're going to suspect that some of the trees are pretty old. You're going to have standing dead trees known as snags. Tree fall gaps where trees have fallen and opened up a patch of sunlight in the forest where you get some of that reinitiation of younger trees in the forest. And woody debris of all sizes and many stages of decomposition. So if you're in a really, really high quality old growth forest, you're going to find very large logs laying on the ground and turning back into soil. You don't get that in places that have been repeatedly or even logged once. It takes a long time to build up those large woody debris. And finally, just generally complex structure. It's a characteristic. So lack of human disturbance, this is a great concept here. It's a really tough one because you can't find a place that has zero human disturbance anymore. Maybe you could 200 or 300 years ago. Nowadays, you cannot. And this is a great example. This is a chestnut tree that was never cut, but it died from chestnut blight, which was introduced by people. We are wreaking havoc on the climate, of course. We are constantly introducing new diseases and pests. And yeah, we're having a lot of unwanted effects on our forest. But when I say lack of human disturbance, I mean kind of the lack of stuff that is kind of direct human activity. Mixed age canopy. This is a great spot in Nantahala National Forest, Buck Mountain. And this is a great example of a mixed age canopy. You see these large trees here. This is my friend and colleague, Dan Itmacher. This is about 2006. That tree was 308 years old in 2006. I suspect this one's pretty similar. But you see there's other age classes that are also in the canopy there. Old trees. So old trees, I should also mention that I should back up a little bit. Coming out of the 1994 amendment, the Western North Carolina Alliance decided to focus a lot of attention on mapping and identifying old growth forests and started this Seeking Older Forest campaign that has basically been running since 94, about 30 years. And in that time, over 20 researchers, both scientists and historians, have mapped over 90,000 acres of old growth forest in the Nantahala Pisgah, making it really one of the most important refuges for old growth in the eastern United States, if not the entire temperate world. It's probably, may have more temperate hardwood old growth forests than anywhere else on the planet. And it's hard to say because temperate hardwood forests have been heavily exploited. But these forests, when they were mapped, were all, the age class was all documented through increment boring. And so an increment bore is this tool here, this drill. It's a handle and a 16-inch drill bit, and the drill bit is hollow. And so when you drill it into the tree, you can extract a core that's just like the size of a pencil. And you can count the rings on that core to age the trees. So this is an example of a white oak. This white oak, I believe, was like 28 or 30 inches. It's over 300 years old. It's in Spring Creek Gorge in Madison County. And, but just in contrast, this chestnut oak here on this rock outcrop is like 16 inches in diameter. It's probably older. Did not core this one, but this is a very old tree. Has lots of signs of age, including very interesting bark texture, those crazy gnarly roots. It's growing in a very difficult place, so it's not going to grow fast. So when you're evaluating the age of a tree, you need to consider what kind of conditions it's growing in. If it's very high in elevation or in a very dry spot or a very windy spot, it's not going to grow as fast as those trees down along the creeks that can really put on a lot of wood very quick. Snags, these are standing dead trees. This is Middle Creek Research Natural Area in the Black Mountains, one of the best old growth patches on Pisgah National Forest. This particular snag has a rhododendron growing out of it at like 75 feet off the ground. So this is just an example of the kind of unique habitats that you find in old growth forests. You just don't see that in younger forests. Tree fall gaps are the mechanism through which most of our old growth forest, especially the hardwood forest, regenerate. The big tree falls down, smashes some other trees, creates some light where you get all sorts of young trees filling the gap. In this case, it's going to probably be this buckeye. Next time a tree falls, it's probably going to be a different species. And coarse woody debris. I talked about this already, large trees turning into soil. And this is just a great example of the amount of life that can inhabit these trees. People think of trees dying, and some, foresters, a lot of times they'll say, oh, I hate to see trees going to waste. I hate to see them dying. And to me, that's not a tree going to waste. That is the circle of life in full effect, and just a real richness of life that we can all appreciate. And pit and mound formation is another thing you'll see in old growth forest, where a tree falls over, tips up a big root wad, and creates some bare soil that all sorts of wildlife and plants can use. Am I running out of time, David? How am I doing on time? Okay, great. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. So let's review old growth forest in Nantahala Pisgah. Less than 1% of forests in the eastern US are in old growth condition. Less than 5% of the ecoregion we're in, the southern Blue Ridge, is an old growth condition, but about 9% of the Nantahala Pisgah is known to be an old growth condition. Based on surveys by non-governmental organizations, the Forest Service has never taken it upon themselves to actually do an on-the-ground survey. They have some desktop exercises for how much old growth they think they have. A lot of times those are wrong because they rely on some pretty faulty data, in my opinion. So we have about 90,000 acres on the Nantahala Pisgah. The Forest Service touts these 265,000 acres of designated old growth in the forest plan. These are places where the Forest Service has found it convenient to draw some lines on a map and say, these are the places we're going to manage for old growth. Does not mean they're actually old growth forest. Of those areas, we know, the Forest Service knows that at least 100,000 acres of those are less than 100 years old. And some are as young as 30 years old. Some are even younger, actually. I'll show you, get to that in a little bit. There are some very quite young old growth designations that the Forest Service has made. One great example that we've discovered in the new forest plan, they designated the east side of Black Balsam near Shining Rock Wilderness old growth. Has anyone been to Black Balsam? How many trees are on Black Balsam? Not very many trees, right? So that's an old growth forest according to the Forest Service. Most of the designations occur in management areas that already prohibit logging. They're just designations of convenience. There are some that are pretty significant that are inside matrix and interface. The Forest Service did take the areas that Mountain True provided that were rated as Class A, as in having no signs whatsoever of historical logging. And there were some of those in the matrix that were designated. But there are thousands of acres of forest that were designated during the last plan that the Forest Service designated between 1994 and 2020 that they decided not to carry over into the new plan. So it really calls into question how permanent these designations are. They don't seem very permanent right now, and how significant they're going to be. And you know, this wouldn't be a problem except the Forest Service is using these designations to justify the cutting of old growth today. Meanwhile, 13% of the known existing old growth is designated to timber production. That's what Sam was talking about. So we have over 12,000 acres that are potentially on the chopping block in the new plan. Furthermore, 63% of the forest over 100 years of age are designated to the timber production management areas. So the Forest Service does not seem to have taken any sort of systematic approach to have a real strategy to increase the amount of older forest. And that's really important because the forest plan discloses that there's at least a 430,000 acre deficit between how much old growth there ought to be and how much there is today. And if the Forest Service was really serious about complying with the planning rule, they would be trying to restore that stuff. Now, the planning rule says that the focus of the forest plan should be to restore the ecological integrity of the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems of the plant area. How can our forest be in ecological integrity if we are at such a huge deficit of old growth on our landscape? And remember, we're just talking about the national forest lands. This is just 22% of the landscape. If we were going to look at the private lands, the number would be even more striking. So disappointed that this forest plan does not have really any sort of strategy that seems believable, that seems realistic for restoring old growth in any sort of reasonable timeline. And, you know, it wouldn't be that hard, actually. You know, there are several 100,000 acres of forest that are approaching old growth condition. Would have been fairly easy to come up with a strategy in this direction. And, you know, the Forest Service has told us, you know, we have a forest plan that will do, you know, that we gave ourselves permission to do some things that Mountain True and the Sierra Club won't like. But don't worry, we're not going to do any of those things. And we have a really hard time believing that, or I do, because they have timber sales right now that are doing those exact same things that they promised not to do. So the Southside timber sale is probably the highest profile example of this. It's a timber sale in Jackson and Macon County. And in some ways, it's pretty typical timber sale. The Forest Service took an analysis area and identified 300 acres that they wanted to log. Unfortunately, the part about it that's not typical, it's the first timber sale I've seen where the Forest Service acknowledges they're cutting old growth forest and says we're going to cut it anyway. They also acknowledge that they're going to be cutting in occupied habitat of the green salamander, which is a candidate for endangered species listing. And so here it is in the EA for the project, the Southside EA. Stand 3541 meets the operational definition for old growth according to the Forest Service's own guidelines for identifying old growth. And this, I've been to this stand several times. It's exceptionally old. There are lots of trees over 200 years old here, including ones that will be cut, despite what the Forest Service has tried to tell us, we won't cut any of the old trees. Well, I've seen the trees they have marked for cutting, and many of the old trees are indeed marked for cutting. Some of them aren't, some of them will be leaf trees, but unfortunately, the first 90 acres that were sold during this project went up for sale for the second time because under the first bid, it didn't sell. They got a single bidder, got $550 an acre for this 90 acres. So they're selling old growth for $550 an acre here. And the Forest Service is basically daring anyone that wants to stop this to try to sue them in federal court. The Forest Service does, however, have the opportunity to revoke the timber sale if they wanted to, or modify it. They would just have to refund some money to the purchaser. Did I hear a question or? Yeah. I'm not permitted to disclose those matters at this time, but we are I will say we are considering it. Yeah. So, in the Forest Service and talking about the Southside timber sale, they talk about there's already 7,000 acres of the same forest structure in the Southside project that will not be harvested. Those 7,000 acres they're talking about are old growth designations. There are a lot of old growth designations in this analysis area. It includes Ellicott Rock Wilderness. It includes the Wild and Scenic Chattooga River. It includes Terrapin Mountain. But for them to say that's the same age structure is nothing but a bald-faced lie, frankly. And you can go read, Carolina Public Press did a really interesting series on this issue, 4-part story. But this was the Forest Service's statement. They said, old growth isn't rare. What's rare are young forest openings and early sterile habitat for ruffed grouse and golden-winged warbler. Well, guess what? There's never been a golden-winged warbler documented in this project area. Ruffed grouse, it's a species that occurs from Georgia deep into Canada. So yeah, we should manage for these species, but this is not the kind of zero-sum game where we have to cut our oldest and rarest forest to manage for these species. So cynical. And so here is one of the old growth designations in this watershed. This was designated in 2023. This stand was cut in 2014. And the Forest Service thinks it's okay to cut other old growth because this is now designated old growth. This is paper old growth, folks. Don't let the Forest Service fool you. I'm hugging that tree. So the Rough Grouse Society has this great slogan, young trees need hugs too. So I'm hugging that tree because young trees need hugs too. Yeah, I am. Well, I'm a planet hugger too. And so, here's what an actual old growth forest looks like. This is one that was proposed for logging during the Buck project. It was one of the small victories we won in the Buck project. Typically, when we find these places and document them and the Forest Service reviews the information, they remove them. But it's really troubling that in this most recent timber sale, they're going the other direction. I think that's probably about all I have. And so, yeah. Oh, let's actually, before we get into that, maybe we should bring all three of us up here. And all three of us can get to some questions.
Yeah, why don't all three come up and we'll have the mic if you guys want to.
Actually, the video I think is aimed here. So
Okay, hold up here. And when you want to raise your hand, let me take you the mic so that people online can hear. We have 40 people online, so they want to hear your questions too.
Who profits from these sales? Who's getting the profit?
well, ideally, it's the timber ideally, it's the timber companies that would profit from these. I mean, that's how they're intended. It's how the Forest Service is set up. Mm-hmm.
Always has been.
Yeah, that's how the Forest Service has been set up since nearly day one. Yeah.
And the Forest Service benefits too. The Forest Service does get to keep the receipts that they get, that $550 an acre for Southside. They'll get to keep that and use it locally, but it doesn't go very far.
My question is, could we buy the harvesting rights and then not cut it? Like put up $5,000 or
So-
$1,000 and then buy that right and then leave it?
I forgot to mention that Mountain True actually offered to pay the Forest Service more than the highest bidder for those 37 acres. And the Forest Service turned us down. We would not be able to bid on the timber sale because then we would be contractually obligated to cut the timber. And then we could be liable in court and be forced to cut it.
And this has happened in the past. The Forest Service has taken environmental buyers to court and then still sold the timber to another purchaser and had seen it logged. So they'll take the money, sue the environmental group and and still log the timber.
So Josh, can you explain again why designating 265,000 acres as old growth is not a good thing?
It would be a good thing if the designations were long-term and if the forest inside those designations were high quality. And if those designations were not being used to justify cutting actual old growth. To me, this looks more like a paper network that's being used to justify cutting other old forest elsewhere. And there are some really good parts of the network. If those other two problems, things weren't a problem, the using it to justify cutting existing old growth, and if they were durable, I wouldn't have a problem with the occasional younger forest being included at a convenience. But because there's so many problems, it just seems like just really a farce to me. I'm really disappointed.
I share some of the same concerns you have. I past history as a Forest Service planner back to the 94 plan, and I've worked for several agencies, the Park Service and some state agency work. And I have a question related that I have two questions actually. The harvest level now is about 800 acres, I think. Is that about right? Now, I don't know all the details of this plan, but I've read some of it. But it's a tiered system. So I think tier 1 goes up to 1,200 acres a year, some about in there, possibly. And tier 2 goes up a lot, goes up 3,200 acres harvest a year, which is pretty darn high. Now, how much of the concern you have is related to getting into tier 2, and how realistic is the Forest Service actually going to get into tier 2? Because they like to have flexibility. From my history with them, that rangers in particular like to have flexibility where they actually implement or not. They like to have the ability to kind of choose around what's possible. How do you think tier 2 works out? Is that part of the concern, getting that in it? Because it leads to road building, it leads to all other kind of problems. I'm particularly concerned about road building.
Yeah, I'll let others chime in too, but the primary concern is where they'll do the timber harvest and not how much, at least in the short term. The Forest Service has not had the capacity, the sort of staff resources to really grow its timber sale program in recent years. And
now they have less staff. I mean, they're getting less and less. So, I mean, could they ever get into tier 2? I don't know.
So with money from Bipartisan Infrastructure Inflation Reduction Act, they are hiring up right now. And they're hiring primarily silviculturalists. They're forestry techs. I think the biggest danger of them really sort of scaling up and doing a lot more harm comes from sort of associated changes that it's hard to predict. So stewardship contracting is one. So the Forest Service is entering into relationships with organizations that have sort of a vested interest in timber harvest to do timber sale prep and implement things on the ground. So you see groups like, for example, the Rough Grouse Society is entering into agreements with the Forest Service where they put their own money on the table and help the Forest Service with their own staff capacity to generate timber sales. They take the receipts from those sales and then feed them back into new projects. So the Forest Service believes that will help them scale up a lot. And those kinds of things can change pretty quickly. Another limitation for the Forest Service in the past has been its unwillingness to staff its ologies and its NEPA folks to get projects done in a responsible way. But the Forest Service is also trying to take away the procedural requirements that would NEPA. They're trying to take away the NEPA process for even large timber sales. So
that leads to another question. There's a lot of conflict in the Forest Service. Having worked there, there's a lot of butting heads, a lot of different aspects of what makes good management. And a lot of it depends on the administration from my standpoint. Different administration comes in for a while and they change the whole national outlook, which leads to the question, every agency I've known about or worked with or worked for needs reform, needs some kind of land management agencies need reform because their motivations are not always, they're trapped in some ways because of the way they're funded. And they can't staff, they can't do this, they can't, whatever better management would be is difficult in some cases. So what I could, it'd take too long, but I could list 10 ways that they should be reformed, not just the Forest Service, but others too. What do you think? You think there's any chance of reform?
I think a new policy on mature and old growth forests could be a step in the right direction, especially if it's accompanied by some structural reforms that help local officials make better decisions.
I think we want to take some questions from our Zoom.
Yeah, a couple online questions coming up.
We've got 40 Zoom participants, so thank you.
Okay, Deborah Lewis on Zoom has sent in, do the timber sales of the Forest Service supplement the budget of the Forest Service? And do these timber sales drive the policy to increase timber sales?
So do the timber sales drive the budget of the Forest Service? And do the timber sales drive the policy? Is that the question?
Yes.
So I think actually the budget drives the timber sales and the policies drive the timber sales more than the other way around. So, it's a kind of well-known secret or not so secret that the Forest Service has a timber quota that's provided them basically by Congress. It comes to the Washington office. The Washington office gives it to the regional offices and the regional offices tallies that out to the forests. So each forest has a timber quota that they're trying to meet. And so that's really kind of the source of kind of some problems, I think. On the other hand, I do think with the kind of collaborative solution that Sam talked about, where the Nantahala Pisgah Forest Partnership basically gave the Forest Service a map of everywhere that they could log and basically have social license. If the Forest Service is going to try to meet their timber quota in that way, it would probably work out pretty well for everybody. On the other hand, if the Forest Service thinks they know better than the public they're supposed to be serving, it's going to be pretty ugly.
So Sam, you mentioned that, the Biden executive order, I think that was April 2022, to protect old growth and mature forests. Why wasn't that part of the plan, influencing the plan? Because, it happened almost a year ago.
It's a great
Before the
question,
plan
and you'd
came out.
have to ask the Forest Service. I think the real reason is because the cake was basically baked at that point. The Forest Service under prior the prior supervisor, Alan Nicholas, had just a directive from the top to avoid making any protective commitments for old growth. So they decided to do that, and then they moved on. And when the Biden administration came in, it was just a little bit too late to turn the ship.
Yes, I'm wondering, what 4 or 5 things would you suggest that we as activists do to mess up this plan? Or try to.
I don't know if I'll take a first stab at it. First of all, the plan is finalized. So any further action to influence the plan, like my other presenters have said, would be through either litigation or through maybe the public being so upset with the plan that they choose to make an amendment on their own. Assuming that we'll have to live with the plan for a while as it is, we certainly need more eyes and ears and feet on the ground in the forest. We have organizations like Mountain True and like Southern Environmental Law Center, and of course Sierra Club, to if there's something bad proposed in one of the areas that would damage the values we've all talked about tonight. The importance, because right now, for any major project, they have to go through the same NEPA process with public involvement. Although, as has been mentioned, they're trying to slim that down. The NEPA process is the way the public can get involved at the project level right now, which we're going to see projects being proposed under the new plan, some of which may very well damage these values we've talked about tonight. So to stay alert, you know, I'm a member of the Sierra Club. I'm a member of Mountain True, to make sure that you're aware of any action alerts. If you have the wherewithal to be a volunteer and to learn about forest planning and management and actually be part of the Forest Watch effort, you can get on the list with the Forest Service to be notified about the projects that are being proposed. And you can join the team of folks that kind of raise the red flag when there's something amiss. Any want to add anything?
Yeah, I think one of the most important thing folks can do is just to talk to your friends and neighbors and family and let them know that this forest plan is a disappointment. I think there's most people don't know that, I think. You know, beyond that, I do think that there, you know, in 94 or 92 rather, when the 87 plan was remanded, that was the result of a multi-year petition drive. Maybe we should get, you know, try to get 100,000 signatures to remand the plan. And yeah, definitely, like David said, watching those individual actions that the Forest Service does. You know, if they do propose a timber sale on Cedar Rock Mountain, where everybody knows they shouldn't, but they might, now that the plan is out, you know, they need to hear about it from people just like you. Yeah.
And I'll just mention one more thing. You know, we've talked about that the forthcoming potential policy on mature and old growth forests. That is not going to happen without a lot of grassroots support and demand for it. The White House is going to have to tell the Forest Service to do this thing. And so we need to have their backs. We need to make it politically possible to get that policy done. Well, there will be sort of official times that we can notify everybody with action alerts that this is the time to do the thing.
Yeah, if you're signed up for Sierra Club or Mountain True's action alerts, you'll get the notice. We have an online question.
Yes, we do. Actually, it's more of a comment that you might want to respond to from Mary Ann Rakoff. Although I applaud you for your research and advocacy, the Forest Service has gathered stakeholders who apparently have advised them alternatively or have come to different conclusions. Agencies of the federal government have very wide berth to make their decisions. Think the Texas court who has rethought the research of the FDA to approve pills for an early abortion. And she's thinking about the litigation level of all of this.
You know, agencies have a lot of discretion to make their decisions when it comes to judicial review. They also are bound by really clear statutory requirements and regulatory requirements that they've imposed on themselves. I think in this case, you know, the Forest Service has gone even further, and it has adopted its own definition of ecological integrity that's really good. So it's given itself a high bar to clear and then failed to do it. So you know, yes, the agencies get a lot of discretion, but we see a lot of problems with this plan that are well outside the bounds of that discretion.
I have kind of two questions. One, how do the clear cut areas regenerate? Is it natural? Do they leave seed trees? And the second question is, where's most of this going? I've been told a lot of this wood, this hardwood is being turned into wood pellets, shipped to Europe, and they're burning it for heat and claiming this is their way of being regeneration or restorable renewable energy. Then is that true?
So a couple questions. Does the forest, there are three questions, I think. Does the forest, is it replanted? And the answer to that is sometimes, but usually it doesn't need to be. We have a very fertile area with summer, we get summer rain here, and that allows natural regeneration to be pretty successful here. I think the problem is that sometimes the kind of heavy logging that's done isn't good for regenerating oak trees, and you get a lot more poplar and maple and things like that. Another problem is that sometimes if harvest is done, there's no natural fire. And I will say that the increase in fire management is probably the best thing that happened in the new plan, in my opinion. But a lot of the timber harvest happens in the absence of any kind of fire. And without that fire, you don't get the same diversity of tree species that we were getting 100 years ago when fires were burning. Second question, where's the wood go? Most of it goes to saw timber. Most of it gets turned into boards. And some of that saw timber, quite a bit of it, last time I checked, actually is going to Asia, where furniture is made nowadays. And then finally, is any of it going to wood pellets to go to Europe to burn in their coal-fired power plants and be called renewable energy? Not from the mountains. It's just too expensive to ship anything from the mountains over to Europe. We have to ship overland such distances, and that's a pretty low dollar market. Where that's happening is in the southeastern coastal plain, where it's very close to the ocean, and they can put that stuff on boats and float it across the ocean and use Archimedes' principle to lower the shipping costs, instead of having to buy diesel to put it on trucks and trains and things like that.
Any final questions before we turn it over to Nancy to close us out?
I will add just one brief that in the eastern part of the state, of course, I believe the Southern Environmental Law Center and our Sierra Club coastal groups are active in trying to oppose and do something about the wood pellets.
We had one written comment.
I'm gonna tag on one thing. It's not impossible that we could see pellet production come to the mountains. A lot of that depends on bigger picture policy. So if the federal government is subsidizing pellet production and bioenergy that way as a renewable source of energy, that could change.
Yeah. I had one more question about bog turtles and bog communities and refuge for I think this is referring to the proposed Mountain Bogs National Wildlife Refuge that has been approved, but hasn't really been created yet. Just to note, in regards to the forest plan, I do think bogs are well protected. I think wetlands are fairly well protected in the forest plan. Bog turtles are a federally threatened species that are dependent on open, sunny wetlands. And they have a lot of problems, including diseases, including collection in the pet trade, et cetera. And there is this possible Mountain Bog National Wildlife Refuge. But like I said, most of these bogs are on private land, would need to be purchased, and the refuge still needs to be created. I know Nature Conservancy is working on that. I know, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service is working on that some, but I don't think it's come very far yet.
Well, if that's everything, then I think we need to give another round of applause for Josh and Sam and David for such a terrific program tonight and bringing us information that was very valuable, whether we wanted to know all of it or not. We appreciate learning it. So thank you. And I would also like to thank all of you for being here, whether you were in person or the 40 people that were on Zoom with us. And we hope you join us again next month on June the 7th, either in person or on Zoom, for our program on the past, the present, and the future of the French Broad River with RiverLink. Thank you so much for coming, and have a safe trip home.